Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next in our series of Inaugural Lectures. Clearly a very important lecture series as we go through the year, and opportunity, as I say, often to show off the talent we have in the university, whether they be internally promoted professors or appointees to the university. Again, as I often say, very difficult for those of you in the room who have given such lectures, quite difficult lectures to judge in terms of the audience and the nature of the topic, finding that balance between wanting to show off how much you really know as a newish professor, but actually making sure that the audience, which can be quite broad-based, actually understands what you're talking about. Clearly, we've got a very experienced professor this evening, so I suggest we're in good hands. So this evening is Professor Shane O'Neill, who Shane was brought up in Dublin, and he undertook a joint honours degree, hence perhaps the affection for Keele eventually, in history and politics, and that was at the University College Dublin. And then he stayed there to do a master's in moral and political philosophy. From there, he went to Glasgow University for his PhD, and that PhD sought to work out what justice demands of us in a world of culturally diverse societies that are all marked by a plurality of worldviews. And the outcome of that PhD was published in 1997 as a monograph entitled Impartiality in Context. Shane's first substantive academic post was then at Manchester University, but then he went across to Queen's University, Belfast, where in fact he stayed for more than 20 years. First promoted to readership, and then in 2002 as Professor of Political Theory. During that time, clearly a very interesting time in Northern Ireland, and Shane's research was very influential in some of the key political debates around Northern Ireland, as I say, in what was clearly a very highly charged and important period in that part of the world. He came to Keele in September 2016 to take a position as Executive Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Planning and Advancement. Unlike some of us, Shane manages to retain an active research interest, and he is here as our Professor of Political Theory, and it's in that capacity that he's going to speak to us tonight on universities as instruments of social freedom. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Shane O'Neill to deliver his inaugural lecture.
Right, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I hope you haven't missed the one glorious opportunity for a nice barbecue this summer. So I appreciate very much your coming, and thanks to Trevor and Mark and indeed everybody at Keele for making me feel so welcome since I got here, so at home and feeling like as if I'm in the right place. And also thanks, Grace is the only person outside of the Keele email list who's here, so my longest standing supporter, Grace, you're very welcome and delighted you could be here. So, right, so as you see, the choice of topic is very much animated by a question that I think is important to any of us who work in universities. If the tendency that politicians have to tamper with higher education is anything to go by, it seems to matter a lot to other people as well. And I think that's appropriate, not the incessant tampering of government, but the fact that the question is appreciated more broadly. So this is pretty much the question, oh, that's the wrong thing. So this is pretty much the question I'm going to address tonight, right? So what are universities for? And it's good to be at a university and part of an executive team that does ask that question every so often. That may be of some reassurance to you. It's important to really ask those kind of fundamental questions if we're going to motivate ourselves to do good work in the organization. Now, if I was to give the most succinct possible answer to this question, which would be a one-word answer, it might be that word there, freedom. And I think many others who've pondered this question a lot more for a greater length of time than I have expressed in various views that it's obviously the value of freedom has to be fundamental to universities. seems obvious that universities play an important role in the development of young people, typically in terms of their becoming autonomous agents in life and so on. And likewise, the importance of academic freedom has rightly been highlighted as a significant role universities have in pushing the boundaries of knowledge and in offering critical perspectives on social, political, and economic and cultural developments. But I don't think this one word is enough, really, to give. It's not a sufficient basis on which to develop a critical theory of the modern university, which is, I guess, ultimately what I'd like to do. Don't think I'll ever have the time to do it, but I think it's an important project to develop a fully fledged critical theory of the university. So I think we need that word as well, okay? And the main thing I'm going to try and do tonight is to try and explain to you why I believe that a comprehensive critical theory of society based on an account of social freedom is the most promising start for us as we consider what universities are ultimately for, what their purpose is, and what potential they have as modern social institutions. Okay, so here's a couple of other questions we're going to have to address along the way. What is critical social theory? I need to tell you something about that because I think in an inaugural lecture you're supposed to kind of give some insight into what you're about as a researcher, as an academic. And so I guess I'm going to have to say something about that, but also because I'm approaching the question of what is universities very much from that point of view. What is social freedom and why consider it as the foundational value for modern society? Well, I've already suggested that we need to contextualize the question as to what universities are for on a pretty broad canvas. I think we need to know what the foundational values of modern societies themselves are. So what are the ultimate purposes of major institutions that characterize contemporary societies? So one key thing I want you to take away is that there's no point trying to think what a university is for in isolation from the question as to what a good society is. Here's a couple of other questions. So, what's the distinct social value and purpose of the university? We're coming to that. And if universities are to be thought of as instruments of social freedom, as my title suggests, what implications does that have? What can we do about it? So, the point is, if we can clarify what universities are ultimately for, it should help us determine some of the priorities that should be relevant for all with responsibilities for universities. That includes government and other stakeholders as well as people in universities. Okay, so it should also help us, I think, at Keele reflect a bit on our own kind of proud heritage in this regard. Right, the value of an inaugural lecture. Well, I've already said you're going to have to put up with some kind of critical theory or philosophy, because that's part of the deal if you come to listen to someone giving an inaugural lecture. It's also an important kind of public role for the university, as Trevor's mentioned, and it's something I think we do well, well, at least up till tonight. That's something that we do well. But that's professional reasons, but there are also some personal reasons, and I do feel a bit of a fraud here, because I did one of these about 16 years ago, as Trevor mentioned. I could have probably got away with not doing one here, but I actually thought it would be a good thing to do. And the main reason why I think it would be a good thing to do is because I felt a kind of personal need, really, to kind of square my research commitments as a critical social theorist with the kind of job I'm doing here, which is to be a dean and a PVC, and the kind of job that I've done for many years at Queen's before I left. So you're not going to get too much autobiography. Sometimes inaugural lectures have quite a bit of that. Not going to try your patience, but just to give a little bit of background as to how this happened. So as an idealistic young person, I obviously ignored all the career advice I ever got in school. That's partly why I decided I went to UCD, an institution, the founding of which, by the way, by John Henry Newman, occasioned probably the most celebrated piece of reflective writing on the idea of university, though I'm not going to be saying much about him. But I went to UCD with the express purpose of trying to study how I might best contribute in some small way to making the world a little bit less unjust. So that was really what I was interested in. And that's why I studied politics, because power and stuff, you got to learn how that works. And history, because you don't know about the past, you don't really know much at all. So I wanted to develop a deeper understanding of processes of social transformation, basically. And by the end of my first degree, I guess I knew I wanted to be a political philosopher. I wanted to study questions of justice, and I was lucky. Somebody paid me to do it. I got a job doing research and teaching in that subject. But then, only about 7 years after I finished my PhD, I ended up as a head of school. And I never really have escaped having some kind of senior management responsibilities since then. So, in some ways, I'm kind of doing this as a therapy, because the critical theorist in me is demanding to know what happened. Okay? So, I'm going to try and, it's going to get quite philosophical now for the next wee while, and then we'll come back to some questions about university. So what is critical social theory? Not easy to explain in a couple of minutes, but here we go. Anyway, critical theorists reject the idea that the social sciences can be modeled on the natural sciences. When we study people and societies, it's inappropriate to do so from the rationally disengaged perspective that's required in the natural and physical sciences. The broad purpose of critical theory is not to facilitate rational control through the application of scientific reasoning, but rather to generate insights that will transform society by maximizing human freedom. So critical social science seeks to be at once explanatory, normative, and practical. It aims to provide explanations as to what the current obstacles to freedom and justice are, to demonstrate why those obstacles are not justifiable, and to offer guidance as to what we might need to do if those obstacles are to be removed. As an engaged form of analysis, critical theory addresses itself in ways that naturalistic social science cannot, to questions of social meaning, and therefore to the self-understanding of social actors, people in the world. It isn't value-free and doesn't claim to be, but remains committed to objectivity, since it is driven by those human values of freedom, equality, and justice that each of us can share. Now, the particular approach to critical social theory that I want to draw on for this purpose tonight is one that seeks to articulate valid and legitimate grounds for social criticism by reconstructing the norms and principles that underpin and guide the major institutions of modern society. Now, we can do this, so this approach that I endorse would have it, through a critical historical analysis of the aspirations and goals that people have struggled for in shaping our contemporary societies. If we can clarify the ethical grounds of our major institutions, and they all have ethical grounds, but despite what some theorists say, then we can use that as a yardstick against which we can judge the ways in which our institutions and practices are now operating. We can ask whether or not they're serving the interests of all, or if they are arbitrarily privileging some social groups over others. So the basic idea is to ask what purposes our major institutions have been established to serve through historical struggles of modern times that are ongoing, and then to assess the ways in which they may be failing to deliver, so that we can then reflect on what might have to be done for them to realize their potential. And in doing this, I'm following here an approach that's inspired by a strand of critical theory, influenced very heavily by the German idealist philosopher Hegel, writing in the late 18th and 19th century. And there are contemporary theorists, Axel Honneth is particularly influential for me, although I fundamentally disagree with him on several things, and he has had nothing to say about higher education. So I'm not going to say anything more about Hegel or Honneth, really, and I'm sure you're relieved about that. Except to just note that I'm seeking to draw on their normative reconstructive approach as the most promising way to understand what the purpose of the university is. In a nutshell, the key claim is that all of our major institutions in modern societies have one overarching purpose. It's a very strong claim, this, right? And that is to create an ethical community that can satisfy mutually the conditions for the realization of individual freedom for all citizens. This then is the bedrock of the comprehensive critical theory of society that I'm going to propose as the basis for our response to the question as to what universities are for. Now, I now need, with apologies to anyone with an aversion to philosophy, to say a little bit more about the particular conception of freedom that is at the heart of this account. Okay, this is as exciting as the slides get. So, in order to understand what a neo-Hegelian critical theorist like me means by social freedom, we need to contrast it with two other accounts of freedom. Now, these various accounts have been foundational for competing theories of justice in modern societies and of associated conceptions of the good society. So first, we have an account of negative freedom. Associated with the thinking of early modern theorists such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, a version of which remains core to the neoliberal vision of society. So on this account, we judge a human being's freedom by the extent to which there are no external impediments preventing that individual from pursuing whatever desires and wishes they may happen to have. Now, if this is all there is to human freedom, then it might follow that our social and political orders should seek to minimize the extent to which other individuals or the state should be permitted to interfere with individual people's egoistic pursuit of their own desires. And justice on this account is merely the enforcement of subjective rights to non-interference, including primarily perhaps property rights. So we should just allow egoistic individuals to compete with one another in an unfettered market for money, attention, the best jobs, and so on. The neoliberal assumption is that the most talent will win and that somehow society is going to benefit. I think we all know how that normally works out. Now, one of the main problems with this negative account of freedom is that it fails to grasp the extent to which freedom is also, for most of us, thought to be an expression of an autonomous free will, or the expression of an authentic self. So philosophers like Kant and Rousseau, who have very different perspectives, but would be associated with this way of thinking. Rousseau, by the way, there's a kind of a North Staffordshire connection, one of the greatest political philosophers. He spent some time writing his Confessions in a cave in somewhere on the way to Ashbourne, I think. And we have an annual lecture, which is good connection to have, Rousseau, definitely. Now, if we think of, say, an addict, whether it's an addiction to drugs, sex, alcohol, gambling, or whatever, or somebody who's vulnerable to manipulation, then these people act in a way which is entirely free in a negative sense. Nothing's stopping them, no external impediments on their feeding their addiction or whatever. But their freedom seems tragically limited in that they do not act in a way that is aligned to what we might call a reflective free will. In other words, their actions aren't guided by their own better intentions, typically, by a suitably refined will that prioritizes important actions and priority, rather than merely following every whim and desire that we might have. From that broader conception of freedom as autonomy or authenticity, the point of a just society is to facilitate the realization of all individual citizens' reflexive freedom. And there are many strands of egalitarian liberalism that adopt this view and have fed into influential theories of justice. Now, I want to argue, following first Hegel, that reflexive freedom is also inadequate as an account that captures the true value for human beings of pursuing their life plans in a modern society and participating in its key institutions. A reflexively free will merely has the potential for freedom, but it can only facilitate real freedom if the content of that will is aligned with practical options that are actually available to that individual in society. In other words, those things that we truly want have to be available and attainable by us within the social context in which we operate if we are to realize those ambitions and to become free. So real freedom, or social freedom, has both subjective conditions associated with a refined free will, but also objective conditions that may not be directly within the individual's control. So without a culture or community that can accommodate our free, reflexive will, we cannot be thought to be genuinely free. Right, so that was a bit abstract, right? Some examples might help. So let's think, for example, of those women who may have wanted to be involved in politics just over a century ago, late 19th century, say. but were denied this expression of their autonomy by the limits of the social contexts, not even being allowed to vote in elections. So they may have had a refined free will, but they weren't free. Or a gay couple who may have wanted to marry not so long ago here, but who were denied the chance to realize that expression of their authentic selves. This is still a case, of course, in one part of the United Kingdom I'm familiar with, and in many other countries. Or of the many people who might have made far better surgeons than some of those who are very well paid to do that important work, but who, due to inequalities and disadvantages they faced in their social and educational circumstances, never had a realistic opportunity to even explore that career route. Social freedom, when fully instantiated, is characterized by an ethical community that can accommodate for all citizens equally the opportunities to realize the content of their reflexive free will. It specifies the necessity of those objective conditions that make it possible for us all to have equal chances of realizing our potential to have fulfilling and autonomous lives. Of course, not everyone will be able to achieve what they want, but nobody should suffer the indignity and hurt of being arbitrarily denied privileges that are available to others in realizing their autonomous will, as illustrated by the 3 examples I gave earlier. It is worth highlighting that social freedom is compatible with and inclusive of the values we associate both with negative and reflexive freedom. That's why I present the relationship between them in this stacked Venn diagram. But it is social freedom that underpins the major institutions of modern society, since those institutions provide the opportunities through which we can actualize our free will. This, I think, captures the important insight that social bonds of solidarity are necessary conditions for individual freedom. The freedom of each is dependent on the freedom of all. We can only live autonomously if we're supported by the various social relations through which we are recognized by others. It's those social relations that we rely on for self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem. So this then is the fundamental basis of a comprehensive critical theory of modern society. The intention is to unearth, through critical historical and social analysis, the ways in which our major social institutions promise to deliver social freedom by bringing us together, forming and nurturing bonds of cooperation that will provide us with a range of options through which we can instantiate and realize our reflective desires and aspirations. The possibility of criticism emerges when we can identify ways in which our institutions are failing to support the ambitions of some or all of the people of a society to achieve real social freedom. And it's important to highlight the claim is not that it would be nice or it would be good if we could shape our institutions to deliver social freedom, but rather that we would not even have the set of institutions we do have had they not been established through historic struggle to create a context that would be accommodating of equal social freedom for all. So these are not commitments that we should have, but rather they are the ethical norms that we are already committed to. This seems to have... Now, you'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to present any further detail on the kind of critical historical reconstruction that would be needed to fully support the claim I'm making here for the primacy of social freedom as the foundational value of modern society. But just before I go on to show how universities fit in here, it's important to highlight 3 spheres of social relationships that are particularly significant, at least on this Hegelian account, for individual freedom. These 3 spheres correspond to 3 basic needs that each of us has in securing the sort of positive relation to self that facilitates our freedom and that allows us to flourish as human beings. Personal relations first. We typically find our inner selves, our sense of our own personality and so on, primarily through close personal relationships with intimate partners, family, close friends, and so on. And that helps us to achieve basic self-confidence. In the social relations we have through the exchange of services in the middle, and that's in the world of work, paid and unpaid work, in market relations we engage in as consumers and so on, we typically achieve some sense of self-esteem through recognition of the specific contributions we make in realizing our talents in ways that help to meet the needs of others. And thirdly, in the political public sphere, in which we deliberate and actively engage as co-creators of our shared community, we achieve self-respect through opportunities we have to engage with others to improve our own social conditions. Now, if we take this is very important, if we take a long-term perspective on the ways in which these spheres have developed through the history of modern societies, from the collapse of the feudal order basically to today, then we can see how each of these spheres has become more sensitive to the reciprocal needs of formerly excluded others. Think about feminism as just one example in terms of all of those spheres. There has been a slow, undulating perhaps, movement towards greater democratization and equality across all three spheres. But the achievements within all three spheres are clearly fragile, which becomes increasingly clear if we only take a short-term perspective. So if you take a short-term perspective, you might think we're totally gone the wrong direction. But if you look at the long term, there has been an increasing democratization and egalitarian kind of movement across these spheres of modern life. The point is that the demand and thirst for greater levels of democratic inclusion is constitutive for all these spheres of modern life, even if they often fail to realize or instantiate them, sometimes in quite appalling ways. So where do universities come into all this? Finally, I hear you say. As institutions of higher education that have a privileged role in the process of individual formation, universities are key institutions in preparing their students for participation in these spheres of freedom. Universities have to afford their students appropriate opportunities through self-exploration to find the best ways in which they can give back to society in the future, in their personal lives, in various exchanges of services, in work and through markets and so on, and in democratic practice. The idea of the university today then? Well, in recent years, there has, as you'll all know, been much contention about the role of the university in contemporary society. Policies regarding the question as to how universities should be funded, in particular how the cost of student tuition should be met, have generated heated debate in many countries, not least in the UK. This has reflected a more general public concern about the role that universities should play in the reproduction of society. This is why protests and debates, such as those regarding tuition funding, but also the industrial action occasioned of late by the dispute about USS pension reform, these disputes tend to move beyond their initial focus onto broader issues regarding the transformation of the university as an institution. In all such controversies, concerns have been raised about a process of marketization in higher education, fueled by neoliberal thinking, in which students are converted into customers. The ideal of universities as cooperative communities of scholarship has been reduced to an aggregate of corporate entities competing with one another in national and global markets. Now, opponents of the marketization of higher education have often, it seems to me, relied on traditional ideals of the university, ones that were first articulated at a time when only a very small and privileged minority of citizens could benefit from the opportunities higher education provides. And that's why, probably unfairly on Newman, founder of my alma mater, I've kind of put him up there as representative of the traditional view of a university. And it should be Newman versus neoliberalism, I suppose, really. That's the way the debate has been kind of framed. Now, since the conceptualization of those ideals, the more traditional ideals of what a university is for, predate the dramatic increases in the levels of participation in higher education over the past several decades, there are good reasons not to use those traditional ideals uncritically in questioning current policies. Higher levels of participation are reflective of a broader process of democratization in which universities have been considered as significant institutional channels through which a more just and egalitarian social order might be realized. There is therefore a need to question current policies regarding higher education by asking afresh what can and should legitimately be expected of universities as social institutions today. That's why it's important that we provide a clear and coherent account of the ultimate purpose and value of universities in the early 21st century, so that we can be in a better position to develop an appropriately up-to-date critical perspective on a range of policy developments, including those related to funding within the higher education sector. So by presenting to you very briefly an account of how a critical theory of society might be reconstructed on the foundational value of social freedom, my intention is to present a more fruitful way to think our way into some of these issues. It gives an alternative view to that which underpins neoliberal thinking, but without falling back on a traditional vision that runs the risks of being both elitist and unhelpfully nostalgic. Okay, so slightly longer, so I think I used 2 words the last time, so this is a slightly longer answer, which hopefully you can still read. So the ultimate purpose of the university on this account is to support holistically the realization of individual autonomy of its students and to contribute in that way, but also through research and engagement, to the enhancement of effective social freedom for all citizens. That's what universities are for, basically. As an institution of higher education, the university should enhance at an advanced level the freedom of its students so that they can maximize their potential to make distinctive, significant, and positive contributions to all of the communities of which they will become members. But a second key priority for each university is to deliver on its responsibility to contribute to the enhancement of effective social freedom for all citizens, not only those students who benefit directly from the educational opportunities it offers. So worthy of note here is the important connection between education and research, and the potential for both, through external engagement, to impact positively on society in local, regional, national, and global contexts. You didn't think you were going to come tonight and not see a picture of this man? Okay. So, as many of you may know, Lord Lindsay, the founder of this institution, was also a political philosopher. He had a view that philosophy had a particular role in maintaining, through criticism and restatement, the standards by which we consider various human activities to be worthwhile. That's not a million miles from the critical method of normative reconstruction that I'm advocating here, but that's not the point. We often reflect here at Keele, as we should, on some of the key features of Lindsay's vision. The breadth of education needed to contextualize expertise in a way that is connected to society's needs. The adoption of an interdisciplinary outlook so that we avoid the distorting effects on research of disciplinary biases. The idea of the campus community that would facilitate the pursuit of truth in the company of friends. And the commitment rooted in his experience with the Workers' Educational Association to provide opportunities for university education to those for whom it had previously appeared out of reach. All of these commitments seem to me to be not only compatible with the account of the university that I'm presenting, but to have prefigured in really important ways the severe limitations of both a neoliberal approach or of a utilitarian view of higher education that does not appreciate the intrinsic value of intellectual work. But Lindsay's defence of the university did not rely on an outdated and somewhat elitist view of the role of universities in society, one that might be characterised by intellectual purism or snobbery. Lindsay was quite explicit about the need to recognise both the intrinsic value of intellectual pursuits for their own sake and the importance of the responsibility for universities to add social value. He found a path, I think, that avoided the pitfalls of intellectual snobbery and purism, crude utilitarianism, or indeed the neoliberal tide that was to follow decades later. At the heart of his vision was a view of university education as a preparation for engagement in democratic life, not just in politics, but across a wide range of social spheres. And I include the family when I talk about democratic life, as well as the workplace and all sorts of civil associations. Now, drawing somewhat critically on his experience of being Vice-Chancellor at Oxford, Lindsay was seeking, in the Keele experiment, to go beyond an exclusive and narrow focus on the intellectual quality of the students, which he thought was a problem at Oxford. He wanted to ensure that the intellectual capabilities of those students would not be celebrated just for their own sake, but that they would also be oriented towards effective leadership in response to the needs of society. He was also critical of something of a cult of expertise that he detected in the research-intensive civic universities, notably Manchester. Again, he saw little merit in expertise for its own sake if it were not focused as a meaningful response to the challenges facing people who were struggling in their daily lives. So even though he drew on institutional, it's very clever, he drew on institutional support from both Oxford and Manchester in establishing the University College of North Staffordshire, later Keele, he was clearly seeking to develop a new account of the socially responsible role of the university. Now, because of this heritage, I do consider Keele to be particularly well suited as an institution that can not only articulate and renew this vision, but one that can also hopefully realise its potential as an instrument for social freedom. And that's a challenge for all of us. Now, if we were to work out in detail how universities are best to realise their potential as instruments of social freedom, and we won't be doing that tonight, or at least I won't, then we would need to consider how they impact positively on their students' potential in all three of the spheres of social freedom referred to earlier, all of which are constitutive of individual autonomy. From the perspective of the university student and prospective graduate, we can refer to these as personal freedom, productive freedom, and political freedom. All three should be supported progressively in an integrated way throughout the educational process. Individual students should, through their studies, be supported in the realisation of their potential and the honing of their particular talents. This enriches them as reflective and creative individuals in their personal freedom, as future work colleagues and team members who can make a distinctive contribution in the exchange of a wide range of services, it's productive freedom, and as critically engaged citizens of a globalising world, political freedom. This then is the core purpose of the university, to produce autonomous graduates who are well equipped to make uniquely distinctive social contributions as caring and cooperative human beings, creative and productive members of civil society, and engaged, difference-sensitive citizens of a globalising world. Policies regarding universities need to take all three dimensions of autonomy seriously, and universities need to facilitate their integration on all of the programs that they offer. So a little word about each of them. Personal freedom. Here I think we need to ensure a supportive environment for personal development. This has probably got more to do with what goes on outside of the classroom, in the broader student experience, but the academic and the extracurricular should be mutually reinforcing of one another in this regard. So it includes the need to prioritise mental health, to ensure that that students experience sexual freedom in ways that are respectful of others, to engage with others in full recognition of the positive benefits of diversity in all its dimensions, and of the equal standing of all in spite of historic and ongoing hierarchies and injustices that we need to tackle. Productive freedom. In relation to this, we need to consider how our courses in all aspects of the student experience prepare students for the world of work. And I don't mean that narrowly in the sense of being employable, getting a job and being paid a certain salary and so on, even though that is clearly of critical importance. I'm also thinking of all the ways in which our students will go on to help meet the social needs of others, how they will go on to participate in teams that make socially valuable contributions, including caring for others, volunteering, engaging in various associations outside of work. we also have a social responsibility to ensure that regardless of the profession they enter and the work they do as graduates, that they will act in a socially responsible way, achieving self-esteem through a recognition of their distinctive contribution to society, making the most of their talents and being rewarded fairly for them. In relation to political freedom then, we need to prepare our students to participate in democratic life, broadly conceived. I'm not talking narrowly politics. To be vigilant about the importance of political rights and the dangers of irresponsible actions that seek to silence or exclude others. They need to be ready to play a full part as co-creators of our democracy, to be ready and willing to play their part in transforming social conditions in ways that will instantiate more fully the commitments to social freedom that form the bedrock of our institutions and our shared ethical life. This is the last slide, but there are a few bits to it. So some further implications. Now, this reconstructive analysis of the value and social purpose of the university has, I think, significant implications for several ongoing controversies regarding higher education policy. And a fully fledged critical theory of the university would obviously have to have much more to say on these than I have here. So I'm going to just make some fleeting remarks really about these major topics by way of a conclusion. Funding and fair access. Okay, it seems to me that fair access based on an egalitarian account of merit should be the normative priority for any legitimate policy regarding the funding of student education in universities and for the allocation of places through admissions policies. Variations with regard to fear of indebtedness, which is probably our current challenge, should not be allowed to play any part in determining who gets to university on which course. That seems to me to still be a recipe for perpetuation of some element of privilege. Now, I can't go into great detail on this. I'm happy to talk later about it. But briefly, because I could have given a whole lecture on this. Briefly, my considered view on this matter, always room for more consideration, but is that tuition should be publicly funded, but from a ring-fenced allocation that is supplied by a graduate tax. There should be no talks of loan or debt. Loans or debt are unhelpful to some people, particularly those who are mostly risk-averse through disadvantage. But it does seem to me to be fair that in the current kind of society we have, a relatively inegalitarian one, that those who benefit most from university education should pay back for the education of future generations. So in a more perfectly egalitarian society, perhaps I might have a different view. But in the current social order where there is, and most universities sell the fact that there is a graduate premium, those who graduate will earn more than those who don't. So because of the graduate premium, I think that justifies a ring-fenced allocation of funding for tuition from a graduate tax. Lots more details would have to be worked out, but that seems to me to be the fairest way. Research and impact. The social and economic value of university research should cohere in a mutually enriching way with the educational mission. Its value should be judged both in relation to its scholarly and scientific excellence, but also according to the extent to which it contributes broadly to the effective social freedom of all across the full range of subjects, and to the achievement of a just set of relations within and across national borders. It is a legitimate expectation within a democratic society that each university should rightly be called to account for the ways in which its research has a positive impact on the wider world. The impact of such research is often channeled through collaborative relationships with a wide range of agencies, organisations and actors in wider society and across the globe. There is, however, a need not just to try to measure impact in a quantitative sense, just how much impact did you have, as REF kind of tends to do, but also to evaluate the extent to which it makes an ethical contribution to realising social freedom. So I kind of have a bit of a problem here with the potential that some kind of relatively exciting piece of science or whatever could actually lead to an impact which might in the long run be quite negative for underprivileged people. So, for example, this is hypothetical, but why reward research impacts that may enable some hypothetical company to extract data and use it unethically to shape people's preferences? are perhaps to be more efficient at unscrupulously exploiting the availability of cheap labour in developing markets. So I think we need to think not just about the actual quantity of impact, but the quality of impact and the ethical quality of that impact. I'm not suggesting I'm going to be advising anyone how we might measure that, but it seems to me an important consideration. Academic freedom. Universities do continue to play a unique and indispensable critical role in processes of democratization and in wider institutional renewal in both national and global contexts. Academic freedom is indeed internal to good teaching and research. If it is violated by the state, private interests, or management practices, then the quality of the work is inevitably diminished. Any university must give priority to the expression of student and staff freedom if it is to serve its social purpose as I've defined it. It will not deliver for students, the state, employers, parents, or anyone else if that isn't understood. This does demand a commitment to open discussion of even the most controversial of topics, but also a responsibility to ensure balance so that all voices are heard and that controversial views are effectively challenged and scrutinised. Global engagement. In a global context, universities are, it seems to me, uniquely placed to help to ensure that ongoing processes of globalization are driven not exclusively by the imperatives of a global capitalist order, but also by the development of difference-sensitive, shared understandings across cultures. I'm not going to go into much detail here. Those of you who came to my Grand Challenge lecture several months ago will know that my own account of global justice is one characterized by the need for a more substantive process of decolonization in the world. And I think universities have, through partnerships and collaborations, as well as the educational opportunities offered to international students, an important role to play in this. Finally, just a cautionary note regarding the dangers associated with overly simplistic metric-based approaches that have been used to rank and by implication to judge the value of universities. We like some of them, and rightly we like the ones that put us near the top, and there are several that do put us near the top. But I think we need a far more comprehensive and normatively robust set of criteria. This isn't just us, this is the sector, I think, if we're to grasp fully the value and social purpose of universities today. Only some ethically sensitive criteria will allow us to evaluate critically both government policies on universities, but also the ways in which universities themselves contribute effectively to their own societies. That's it.